The friendship between Georges Danton and Maximilien Robespierre, the two great men of the Republic, had been long and fraught. At one time they were thick as thieves, hanging together that they might not hang separately, on the same page on most issues. But things had changed. Priorities had shifted. Throughout 1793, Danton's overt infidelities were grating on Robespierre. He lamented Danton's loud mouth, his drunkenness. Robespierre was quietly offended that while he received a polite handshake, Danton enjoyed a warm embrace. Likewise, Danton had his qualms with Robespierre. He didn't like his austere nature, the fact that he viewed the world in deeply moral terms, as good or bad with nothing in between. Personal quibbles were ignorable for as long as the two were striving toward the same end, but by the end of the year that was no longer the case. Political differences were manifest and irreconcilable. Robespierre slipping into authoritarianism, a proponent of the Terror, a man who envisioned a regeneration of the moral character of the nation, and Danton, who wanted compromise, an end to the Terror, and a true democracy. While they agreed on much, such as the successful conclusion of the war and an end to de-Christianization, by 1794 they were too far diverged to reconcile, and the results had been terrible. The last time either of them spoke face to face was on the night of March 22nd. Robespierre was hosting a dinner party at his rented apartment on the Rue Saint-Honoré, a small affair for friends and colleagues mostly. Danton was invited as a matter of courtesy, and though he might have refused, he instead chose to meet with his old friend, perhaps hoping to bury the hatchet. No doubt after a few glasses of red, Danton began, "Let us forget our private resentments, and think only of the nation." Mulling over these words for a moment, Robespierre countered with a barbed retort. "I suppose a man of your moral principles would not think that anyone deserved punishment." Danton's reply was equally as venomous, "And you would be annoyed if none did." Robespierre then said, "Liberty cannot be secured unless criminals lose their heads." At the end of the evening, Danton tried for an embrace of Robespierre, which was rejected. Robespierre could barely suffer the sight of Danton in his presence. 2 days later, on the evening of March 24th, the day Hébert and company went to the guillotine, both Robespierre and Danton happened to be the opening evening of Legouvé's Epicharis and Nero at the Théâtre Français. Robespierre was with his secretary up in a box seat, while Danton and a few friends sat in the front row, within full view of the box. Observers noted that when Epicharis denounced Nero as a tyrant, Danton's mob made a scene, applauding loudly and singling out Robespierre. The episode spooked him quite badly. It was less than a week later on March 30th that the Dantonists were arrested. And on April 5th, a few days after that, they were all guillotined. And with that, it would be easy to say, as is the usual narrative, that the Republic now entered into a phase of totalitarian dictatorship. This image has Maximilien Robespierre as the undisputed master of the Republic. Favourable depictions will have him as a strongman, a guiding hand, a dictator in the classical sense, a citizen imbued with extraordinary powers in a time of extraordinary peril. Less than favourable interpretations depict Robespierre as a Manichean psychopath, who had long sought the supposedly unchecked power he now wielded. It shouldn't surprise you, but no, neither of these two extremes accurately describe Robespierre at this time. Indeed, the more general assumption that this was a period of extreme violence, a Jacobin-ordained terror, is likewise flawed. Power, in these final few months of the revolution, was not wielded by Robespierre alone. Instead, it was invested in the Committee of Public Safety, who worked on behalf of the Jacobin Club. The committee itself was empowered not by any sort of long-term design, but as an exigency of war, there to shepherd a flagging economy, defeat a pan-European coalition, and root out those suspected of fomenting counter-revolution. Few in the committee or elsewhere thought that this situation was ideal, though they did accept the committee as legitimate. Robespierre was of course the leader of the Jacobins and the most powerful committee member. But he was far from the sole decision-maker, and shared his power with 10 other men. It used to be 12 until Seychelles got the chop. Despite being only 35 and the third youngest man on the committee, Robespierre exerted a great deal of influence, giving direction and purpose to their operations. But this was not a personalist dictatorship run in his name. Every committee member was relied upon for their expertise and consulted when decisions were to be made. From among the committee, Robespierre relied upon 2 of his closest allies and personal friends to keep things going in the direction he thought they ought to. The first of these men was Georges Couthon. By April, he'd long since returned from Lyon and assumed a dominant position within the National Convention. He was something of a party whip and kept the convention quiescent, allowing Robespierre to act with relative impunity from within the Committee of Public Safety. This in turn allowed the Jacobins to pass any and all laws they desired. Such a signal service did not go unrewarded, and Couthon was a sitting member of the Committee of Public Safety also, and thereby ingratiated into Robespierre's inner circle, so much so that he was probably the third most powerful man in the country. The second most powerful man was Louis-Antoine Saint-Just, Robespierre's right-hand man. Loyal and capable in equal measure, he now served as both a convention delegate and a leading member of the committee. Most recently, he had proved decisive in seeing the Dantonists tried and executed. For this and many other bloody successes, Saint-Just had earned a grim sobriquet, the Angel of Death, quite a title for a 26-year-old. Adding to this legend was a rumour spun by political enemies that Saint-Just had secreted away the skin from victims of the terror and wore them as clothing. Not at all true, but try telling that to anyone at the time. It's worth noting that while all three men were working towards the same ends, their political motives for doing so differed in small but important ways, something that would cause tensions down the road. Couthon was deeply pragmatic and reserved, always wanting to follow the path of least resistance. Where possible, he advocated for compromise and promoted civil rights, lamenting the authoritarian turn of the Republic. Though a proponent of the terror, Couthon often clashed with Robespierre as something of a voice of moderation, and in this regard he rarely got his way. Nonetheless, Couthon did loyally follow Robespierre. Saint-Just was similarly loyal, but with a catch. We've already seen that Saint-Just was his own man, and far more radical than Robespierre. Indeed, if Saint-Just had had his way, a strategic alliance with the populist Hébertists would not have been out of the question. When Hébert had died, Saint-Just, though instrumental in his demise, admitted to a colleague that, quote, "the revolution is frozen." For now though, altogether, Robespierre, Couthon and Saint-Just formed yet another of our revolutionary triumvirates, which we might as well call the Triumvirate of the Terror. All three presided over the Republican dictatorship. At the centre was, of course, the 11-man Committee of Public Safety. They were technically subordinate to the 6-man Executive Council, though in reality the council took its cues from the committee. Power was also ostensibly shared with the Committee of General Security, but again they were heavily put upon. In day-to-day operations, they were not the model of bureaucratic efficiency. Each committee member had their own specializations, own interests and own purviews, though few focused in exclusively on these affairs. Carnot's purview was military affairs, but necessity saw him encroach on economic policy. Saint-Just preferred to legislate on matters legal and political, but he was drawn into economic debates. Barrère weighed in on everything, and was alone responsible for 244 decrees issued in the tail end of 1793 out of 920 total. At various points, these men were in and out of the capital on committee business. Those that were available met in the Tuileries Pavilion de Flora only late at night, usually after 9 p.m, as it was the only time they could spare. All were members of the convention, which met in the afternoon, and worked until mid-evening. Immediately after, most would attend the nightly debates of the Jacobin Club. Committee business was detailed, deliberative, and exhausting, not helped by the fact that, despite outward appearances, internally the committee was often at loggerheads. Debates sprang up between 4 basic groups: the triumvirate of Robespierre, Couthon and Saint-Just, the more conservative bloc of Carnot, Barrère, Prieur and Lindet, radicals like Billaud, Varenne and Herbois, and then a fairly apolitical group consisting of Claude-Antoine Prieur d'Auvernois, known more commonly as Prieur de Côte-d'Or, and André Jambon. Carnot and Lindet, both military men, also kind of fit into this apolitical group of specialists. They just weren't particularly interested in the terror or revolutionary ideology. Between the massive workload and time constraints, all men lived close by the Tuileries, either with friends or in rented apartments. They barely had time to sleep, to eat, and were constantly needed for something. That something varied wildly. Like I said, each man had his own purview, but there was of course a great deal of overlap, and priorities shifted and changed constantly. Getting to grips with who did what is going to be a bit messy, but here's the general idea. At the head was of course Robespierre. He had a unique position, basically the front man of the committee, concerned largely with maintaining their power and combating their enemies. In actual operations, Robespierre did not dictate policy, even if he did dominate. The concerted effort of Barrère, Prieur and Lindet could usually match the influence Robespierre enjoyed in conjunction with Couthon and Saint-Just. From September through to about February, we've already seen Robespierre focus on matters relating to politics and foreign policy. In this he was joined by Barrère, whose expertise was in law and policing, though he did heavily influence foreign policy too. Barrère also moonlit as a de facto naval minister, but in this capacity he was soon displaced by André Jambon, who had in turn replaced Alexis Thuriot on the committee. Jambon was an ideal replacement, as he had once been a captain. His concerns drew him into debates on foreign policy, as the French Navy and the fate of the ports like Cherbourg, Brest and Toulon were important to bear in mind in deciding military or diplomatic strategy. Lazare Carnot was joined by Prieur and at times Barrère in organising military affairs. Robert Lindet was the custodian of the economy and finance. fields that were intimately related to the provisioning of the army, so he worked hand in glove with Carnot. As I said before, Couthon was something of a whip. Well, before Couthon took on that role, it was Barrère who was the main liaison between the committee and the convention, earning for himself a reputation as a bold-faced liar. Saint-Just, Herbois and Billaud-Varenne were on mission for most of this period. They would start to exert a great deal of influence only after February. Even before the fall of the Dantonists, there was little to suggest that this would not be the prevailing political situation for quite some time. This is because every major institution was completely under Jacobin control, that or effectively neutralized. The Committee of Public Safety was, to a man, invested in the revolution's success, and generally favored Robespierre's vision. The Revolutionary Tribunal was entirely at the beck and call of the Jacobins, as President Aumart and Prosecutor Tinville were fanatic supporters. This in turn meant that the terror was at the committee's disposal, the political weapon of the regime. The Committee of General Security took its cues from the Revolutionary Tribunal. Every ministry or subcommittee you care to mention, subsistence, war, finance, were all organs of public safety. Either directly or indirectly, it was all under the committee's thumb. There were only two institutions that could potentially threaten this power, the National Convention and the Paris Commune. But as it was, the convention was cowed into obedience, or else stuffed with Jacobins. Thus, Robespierre gained the benefits of maintaining the thin veneer of democratic legitimacy lent by a nominally independent convention, without having to share any power with them. And as for the Commune, well, the Commune was a bit of a dead letter. They had been the only institution openly opposed to the Jacobins when dominated by the Hébertists, and then once they were disposed of, soon to become a tool of the Dantonists, but of course that didn't go through. With new Jacobin leadership, now the Commune was an asset, not a liability. At this point in early April, the Republic was absolutely devolving into an authoritarian state, run exclusively by the Committee of Public Safety. All things considered though, this is not the most authoritarian regime we've ever seen. There are still nominally independent institutions and free elections, even if these elections usually saw a staggering 1% participation. We have to understand this authoritarianism in the context of wholesale revolutionary change that affected anything and everything. The Jacobins, Robespierre and Saint-Just especially, believed that they were leading France through to the successful conclusion of the revolution, but that myriad threats and enemies, as well as domestic upheaval and a major war, threatened to scupper the whole project. What they saw was the need for a strong guiding hand, a necessary period of dictatorship preceding political normalization and a return to democracy. Now, this line about a temporary period of dictatorship is universal when a new authoritarian regime emerges and then successfully entrenches itself. It's their own justification for resuming total control. It would seem fitting to extend this line of thinking out to include our very own French Republican dictatorship, but for a number of reasons, all of which stem from the fact that they were a temporary revolutionary government. Those in power had a complicated relationship to their own power, not easily dismissed as simply opportunism or the fulfillment of secret totalitarian desires. There's also the obvious point to make that the material desires of the Jacobins aligned with the revolution. Many had done well for themselves with new properties, public offices, and the obvious benefits of social elevation. All the members of the committee would be considered middle-class bourgeoisie, and exemplify the kind of men they all believed ought to hold power. But the rhetorical, theoretical justifications for exercising unrestrained power played an important role too. The thoughts of Robespierre and Saint-Just pretty well summed up the Jacobin position. They viewed their power as entrusted to them by the people as an expression of the general will. There's obviously more nuance than that, but there's the gist. The people were revolutionary, the people therefore supported revolutionary institutions, thus the men in charge were empowered, albeit indirectly. But instead of resting on their laurels, self-flating over being in charge, most of the Jacobins remained committed to continuing the revolution. And this brings us back around to the social and political question. The answer to both these questions was, in Robespierre's mind, something he called the Republic of Virtue. Getting to grips with just what this revolutionary end state looked like is completely essential in understanding what drove Robespierre and the Jacobins more generally. Let's begin by restating that Robespierre was a moralist. He made judgments about institutions, people and places based upon his perception of their moral character. If we take virtue to be a surplus of positive moral traits, like selflessness, humility and enthusiasm, Robespierre believed that those with virtue to be inherently good, and those without virtue to be inherently bad. By definition, the revolutionary were virtuous. The counter-revolutionary were by definition not virtuous. This was to be the basis of citizenship. The Republic of Virtue was a nation in which only the virtuous would live. Since citizens could only be born into citizenship, and thus raised to be virtuous, or become virtuous through devotion to the revolution, Robespierre took it as given that all citizens would by necessity be, quote, citizens of virtue. He was not naive though, and knew that inculcating virtue would take time and effort, and the people were far from ready. He identified three major impediments to achieving the Republic of Virtue. The first was ignorance, taken here to mean a lack of virtue, as well as a literal lack of education. Through the establishment of republican institutions, meant to promote a, quote, moral regeneration, in addition to the building of a robust welfare system, Robespierre hoped to eliminate ignorance. The next impediment was poverty. Here too welfare would help, but the underlying goal was the eradication of wealth inequality, or at least a significant narrowing of the gap. Because like his peers, Robespierre was middle class, and couldn't quite conceive of a world without property, nor the coercive relationship between worker and owner. Certainly the worst excesses were to be curbed, with things like an expansive wealth tax, and even the abolition of inheritance likely under the Republic of Virtue. This all being said, Robespierre's was primarily a political project, and his attempts at answering the social question were flawed, simultaneously paternalistic, and overly idealized. Robespierre's third and final impediment was quite understandable. France was at war. More generally, it was in the midst of a revolution, and grappling with all the crises that entailed. None of the benefits of the revolution, specifically the Constitution, could really be felt until the Republic was guided through these times of trouble by a firm, guiding hand. This whole concept had been developing in Robespierre's mind for some years now, but reached maturity in mid-1793 during the height of the Federalist crisis. Indeed, the dire threat posed by a third of the country in open revolt framed much of the Republic of Virtue. He meant for the Republic to have unity of purpose and a unity of vision. In times of peace, it would be the Constitution which provided this unity. But with civil war raging and the Republican House divided, Robespierre believed that the implementation of the Constitution right now would be disastrous, as it would exacerbate factional rivalries in a moment of peril. He restated all this and more in October. With the Federalists coming undone, there was talk of limited implementation of the Constitution. But Robespierre, who had been installed on the committee since July, had overseen many of the, quote, revolutionary measures that had seen to their destruction. To take the boot from their throat now would be suicide. Partial enactment of the Constitution would cripple the revolutionary measures and deliver France to her enemies by fulfilling their wishes. Hear their cry, let's split the patriots. Let's bring on the dissolution of the Convention. Citizens, let us wait for calm before we enact, in its entirety, a constitution which will be admired by future generations. With so much at stake, is it any wonder why Robespierre turned to authoritarianism? The Republic of Virtue, to him the natural, ideal end state of the revolution, could not be compromised in any way. It had to be protected from the obvious enemies, counter-revolutionaries, the clergy, the nobility, foreign enemies, both the real ones and Robespierre's imagined ones. It even had to be protected from those within the revolution who would compromise on its vision, and thus factions were unconscionable. It had to be protected from, quote, traitorous pens and tongues of political opposition who threatened to turn the hearts and minds of the people away from the revolution. And on the topic of the people, the Republic of Virtue even had to be protected from them, the ones who were meant to be the ultimate beneficiaries of the revolution. Insofar as Robespierre believed, they were not yet a citizen body politic exemplifying only the most perfect virtue. The people were, in his mind, still ignorant, still poor, and for the time being, unable to receive their benefits until the war was won. Authoritarianism was Robespierre's solution, his safeguard for the Republic of Virtue. At least initially it didn't sit well with him, but he consoled himself, and his colleagues, with what they all believed was a fact, that this was all temporary. Let's put a pin in that for now and come back to it, because if forging the Republic of Virtue is the end goal, it required the committee to answer the two essential questions of the revolution, the political and the social. To see how they reckoned with both, we'll have to roll back the clock a wee bit. We return to the Committee of Public Safety in early February. The reason February is significant is because, from early in the month to about mid-March, both Robespierre and Couthon were sick, leaving daily running of the committee and the Jacobins up to the other 9 members of the committee. Robespierre in particular was pretty checked out, contemplating yet again another early retirement, but as always feeling duty-bound to finish his work. In day-to-day operations, the burden fell to Saint-Just, who largely supplanted Barrère. In addition to holding the fort until Robespierre's return, Saint-Just was expected to ensure that the report of February 5th was heeded. While out from under Robespierre's direct supervision, Saint-Just neglected his party duties, rarely attending Jacobin club meetings, instead focusing on his own concerns. And it's here that Saint-Just really comes into his own, because I've mentioned before how they differ from Robespierre's. Well, the better way to describe it might be to say that Saint-Just embodied the logical extreme of Robespierre's political ideology. They both believed in the Republic of Virtue, but Saint-Just went further. These ideas he laid out in a journal, which was then reconstructed and republished posthumously under the title Fragments on Republican Institutions. And it had a lot to say, too much to go into detail about. It'll have to suffice to say that Sonyu saw institutions as being the key to forging the Republic of Virtue. What he meant by an institution was deliberately broad. It not only included obvious things like the convention or the justice system, he also meant cooperative social enterprises and shared experiences. So a political club or a friend group, hell even the shared experience of following the Republican calendar, these things were among Songyu's institutions. In specific terms, he focused in on education, censorship and property relations as the big three institutions which would have to be reformed in order to achieve the Republic of Virtue, and he made detailed notes about each. Reforms to these institutions would produce virtuous citizens, and ultimately he believed that by having virtuous citizens, the Republic would have little need for strict law. Through the mechanism of democratic participation, the people would always decide what was best for the whole nation, elect the best representatives, and forge a perfect society. The end state was a republic without private property that was extremely egalitarian, hyper-democratic at the lower level, but, big but here, one where the state reserved the right to intervene wherever it deemed people to be out of line, whenever it deemed virtue to be undermined. And that last bit is the kicker. It speaks to the origins of the authoritarianism in Songyu's ideology. Because though he believed that virtue would be instilled in the people, he, like Robespierre, recognized that they were not yet there. And that was what he believed that the Republican dictatorship was doing. Getting there required the guiding hand of the dictatorship and the terror. Even then, these two institutions would only be precursors to a quasi-police state that would maintain virtue by any means. For this system to work, Sonyu requires a fixed definition of virtue. It took it as given that since virtue was inherently good, anyone with it was good, and that the state run by and for virtuous people was also good. But he was not a fool and didn't think people were incorrigible, and that was why he espoused strong state repression, to maintain virtue. Such a system could be abused, I think it worth pointing out. Theoretically, virtue could be redefined to whatever the state wanted. But we don't have to worry about that because this will remain just so, as entirely theoretical. Sonyu held this deeply moralistic and oftentimes contradictory system in mind through all that he did. That it wasn't terribly realistic and even conflicted with Robespierre's own vision would cause tensions. With Sonyu preoccupied, it was to be the radical Collot d'Herbois who picked up much of the slack. After being recalled from Lyon for extreme cruelty and then being absolved of guilt, Herbois jumped at the chance to leave his mark on national politics. He led discussions at the Jacobin Club and engineered a rapprochement with Jean-Baptiste Carrier. Hébertists held out hope that perhaps the Jacobins might now side with them and adopt their extreme measures. For instance, they wanted the remaining 75 Girondins, held in jail, to be immediately dispatched. Sonyu was not best pleased by Herbois' charting of an independent course. They came to blows over many important issues throughout February. Where they did align, however, was on matters of economic policy. In this regard, they were both opposed to Barrère. He had spent months plotting economic reform. The main thing was a neutering of the maximum. Caving to the farmers and grain merchants, who were barely making a profit, the committee increased the price ceiling on almost all goods. Obviously, this would infuriate the sans-culottes, but the Jacobins were inclined to take the threat of collapse in the agricultural sector more seriously than the posturing of the Hébertists. Only the most egregious excess would now be punished. These changes might seem cruel, but only codified what had been happening for months now as the maximum broke down. Exceptions were being granted frequently by the committee or representatives on mission. The committee viewed the maximum as a temporary measure, largely a concession to the enragés, and the time had now come to remove it. And though they would retain the interventionist angle, it was now largely in service of facilitating free trade. In fact, Robert Lindet and his Committee of Subsistence led the charge here, handing over some state-owned manufactories to private interests, and allowing farmers to sell to foreign customers provided they import valuable resources or manufactured goods in lieu of straight specie. Herbois was the only staunch supporter of the current system. Sonyu offered his own lukewarm defence, however they were in the end both outvoted. But radical economic reform was not off the table. On the contrary, both were making proposals for wealth redistribution. Specifically, Sonyu wanted to parcel out state-owned farmland to poor peasant families. Eventually, these plans were endorsed by Billaud Varennes and Herbois. Together, these three were the most economically radical members of the Committee of Public Safety. And though Herbois had ideas, and Sonyu had written them down, Billaud Varennes were the most mature and the most extreme of them all. He'd written a book called Elements of Republicanism, published in October of 1793, which laid out his ideas. These included confiscation of land and property from the wealthy, and equitable redistribution of this stuff so that all would have an equal footing. He plotted a fundamental reconceptualization of property wherein all ownership was viewed in the context of its service to society as a whole. And he wanted to eliminate want, to answer much of the social question by creating a welfare system and guaranteeing the right to work. Out of context, a lot of Billaud Varennes' ideas could be part of a socialist manifesto of the 19th or 20th centuries. Held the right to work is credited to Louis Blanc, a French socialist briefly in office in 1848, during the short-lived Second Republic. But it's worth remembering that Billaud Varennes, no less than all of his contemporaries, was coming at the social question from a very Enlightenment-centric angle. He justified much of his radical ideas in terms of establishing Rousseau's social contract. The abolition of wealth inequality and economic deprivation he saw as necessary preconditions for a return to natural order. At a glance, Billaud Varennes seems to dismiss one of the sacred tenets of Enlightenment liberalism, that property is sacred and is owned by the individual to do with as they wish. In truth, he had a profound respect for property, but saw it as serving not the individual, but the collective. Understanding that distinction was not something that the more mainstream committee members were likely to do. We just saw Barrère follow a far more economically liberal line, and in that respect he was peeing a pod with three other committee members, Lazare Carnot, Pierre Poirier, and Robert Lindet. All three were operating in the Enlightenment conception of economic liberalism, espousing above all free trade and private ownership. They were also operating in their own best interest. All four stood to lose personally if redistribution went through. A small aside, what they were doing, let's not forget, was radical by the standards of the day, even if to our ears it sounds quite traditionally capitalistic. It's just that within the context of intra-committee debates, these four represented the more conservative side of the economic policy. That's important to bear in mind. Anyway, this group was worried that more interventionism might stifle free trade at a time when the French domestic economy was grinding to a shuddering halt, as so much money and material went to the war effort. They were determined to restart free trade, and as such made concessions to the merchants and businessmen, as embodied in Barrére's policies. Moreover, they intended to respect the private property of the well-off, the important exception being the property of enemies of the state, which was fair game in their eyes. This property was meant to be given out to the needy, but as Robert Lindet was basically in charge of national economic policy, he made sure that this one and only radical economic policy saw the light of day, despite fierce debate. And that's something to note. These points were hammered out in serious but also quite genuine debates. And thus when the votes on economic policy overrode Saint-Just, Herbois and Billaud Varennes, they weren't too miffed. But do you know who these policies did piss off? None other than the Hébertistes, of course. The brief window of cooperation made possible by Herbois' courting of Carrier was slammed shut. Now the political question was recapitulated. A package was cobbled together consisting of new economic policies, confiscation of yet more property from counter-revolutionaries, and a couple bits and bobs that strengthened the power of the Revolutionary Tribunal. As Saint-Just was the architect of a lot of these plans, and currently the convention president, as well as being the best public speaker in the country bar maybe Danton, he unveiled what we now call the Ventose Laws, touting them as a means of combating malign foreign influence. The laws were ratified by a vote on February 26th, with a few more squeaking through on March 3rd. Ratification, however, was not the same thing as implementation, which was left up to the convention, and little of the Ventose Laws would be enacted before Thermidor struck. Furthermore, the economic reforms were based on little more than presumption on the part of Saint-Just. His focus had always been primarily political, and thus he had little understanding of how the working classes actually lived, and what would improve their material conditions. He was not dismissive of their needs, just ignorant. Saint-Just described them as indigent poor, and thought that merely giving them land to work would solve their issues, despite the obvious problem that the urban poor were not farmers. Real money would be put in their hands, a small percentage of the proceeds from confiscated properties, but as this was paid out in the assignat, the Ventose Laws could do next to nothing to actually put food in hungry bellies. The real effect of the Ventose Laws was to further enrage the Hébertistes. It's here that Hébert begins to organise his abortive Journée. Though we know that the Journée was a flash in the pan, the committee did not. To them it was a near miss, and came at an awkward moment when Robespierre's foreign plot was milling about. Fear of the foreign plot had already been used to prime the convention to ratify the Ventose Laws. Now the plot would be used to delegitimize the failed Journée and Hébert himself. Robespierre had warned for months now, as a part of his spiel about the foreign plot, that there would be factions, influenced by or in league with foreign elements, and that their goal would be to derail the revolutionary train. Saint-Just followed this line of reasoning closely, and naturally presumed that the Hébertiste faction was a foreign influence. But neither he nor the committee could escape the fact that what the Hébertistes had tried to do was legal, and more than that, inherently pro-revolutionary. They had just tried to overthrow a tyrannical government after all. Thus the Journée represented, in the minds of the committee, the revolution led astray, in this instance by a populist faction supposedly in service of foreign foes. Barrère, once a staunch advocate of the sans-culottes and who had joined calls for a revolutionary army, made a complete 180-degree shift in opinion. Like his colleagues, he now believed that the regime had to entrench, no longer tolerating dissent from the people who were innately good or from political opponents who were evidently counter-revolutionaries. But making this reorientation would take some doing, and the job was left up to the ever-ready Saint-Just. The way he threaded this needle was to make the point that though the right to insurrection was recognised as per the rights of man, it was illegitimate if its target was already revolutionary. Remember, Saint-Just understood the current system as ensuring virtue, wherein the people were sovereign. Thus anything that tried to undermine this system threatened the general will, and was inherently counter-revolutionary. In such instances where things seemed to have gone off the rails, the government reserved the right to course correct. All of this was made plain to the convention in a speech Saint-Just gave on March 13th. And it was not lost on the convention that Saint-Just was only somewhat targeting the Hébertistes and the Cordeliers, responsible for the Journée. In truth, he was letting it be known that political opposition, no matter its form, would be considered counter-revolutionary. This was the Committee of Public Safety and the Reign of Terror digging in, refusing to budge. Even loyal opposition would be considered traitorous, their loyalty but a feint. Opposition would be decried as factionalism, on which Saint-Just had this to say. Every party is then criminal, because it is a form of isolation from the people and from popular societies, a form of independence from the government. Every faction is then criminal because it tends to divide the citizens. Every faction is then criminal because it neutralizes the power of public virtue. Put another way, Saint-Just was requiring the convention to support the Jacobins unquestioningly. The Jacobins were no mere faction, but instead the legitimate government, entrusted with a general will. He was asking them to see the fortunes of the Republic as inseparable from the fortunes of the Jacobins, and any division within their ranks as a dire threat to the unity of the nation. Factionalism, therefore, and in the unanimous estimation of the committee, threatened the revolution. Here too the foreign plot reared its head, as Saint-Just connected factions to the plot as a means of delegitimizing the moderate Dantonists. This ought to make it easier to understand how so many Jacobins were willing to see their own mates guillotined in April. By then, both Robespierre and Couthon had well and truly returned, and the committee redirected to its true purpose, to create the Republic of Virtue. The Great Terror was but a part of this process, and centred mostly on Paris. Indeed, the terror was winding down everywhere else, but the authoritarian shift in policy after the Ventose Laws was otherwise keenly felt. From April through to June, the Committee of Public Safety heavily centralised the Republic. The first order of business was assuming what remained of executive powers. As it was, the Committee of Public Safety was only the most powerful of a number of government ministries which included finance, war, discussion, etc. Though they cooperated with these ministries, Les Carnot saw fit to subordinate them to the committee centrally, or otherwise incorporate them as basically subcommittees. Announced on April 1st and rolled out a few days later, Carnot's reform saw the creation of 12 subcommittees orbiting the Committee of Public Safety. This included the Committee of Subsistence, which was renamed the Committee of Commerce and Supply, and continued with the state capitalism started with the repeal of the maximum. The Committee of General Security was its own special case. Though aligned with the Committee of Public Safety, General Security had been nominally independent. Well, that independence had been nibbled away since then. Since September 1793, members were selected by Robespierre and the rest. Even so, General Security was just sort of doing its own thing. By April, a common complaint was that General Security was quick to arrest, but was reluctant to hand suspects over to the tribunal for trial and execution. This was unfair. Only days before, General Security had referred to the tribunal nearly 50 former parliamentarians and members of the Farmers General, and they were obviously not spared the guillotine. Despite paper-thin justification, Saint-Just went ahead and formed the General Police Bureau. Technically, it was the co-creation of both public safety and general security, but in effect, it answered almost exclusively to Saint-Just personally for the first few weeks. On paper, their job was not dissimilar to that of general security, collate evidence on suspects and handle their arrests. In effect, however, they did much more than that. The Police Bureau constantly monitored the civil service, forwarding relevant information to the Committee of Public Safety, who then jointly decided the best response. The system resembled what Saint-Just envisioned for state censorship under the Republic of Virtue. All of this was heavily debated in the committee before being confirmed by a convention vote in mid-April. Included too was a ban on nobles and foreigners residing in Paris, and a slew of laws further empowering the police. So in effect, what the Police Bureau did was reserve for public safety a level of control over policing and justice they were technically not able to exert. This meant that they could decide what would become of the 14,000 or so prisoners held across the nation, Paris being stuffed with 6,000 alone. We've seen the initial debates back in March see proposals for Danton's Committee of Clemency aired to sort through who had been detained on false pretense, Obviously, these plans fell through. In matters of justice, it had long been the committee's hardliners who dominated, and April was no different. Saul-Juste deemed the guilt of the prisoners beyond doubt. To ensure that justice was in the committee's hands alone, several of the major regional tribunals were closed, their prisoners to be processed centrally in Paris. The infamous committees of Orange and Cambrai were excluded, as they were both incredibly zealous and in the strategically vital region of Flanders. It was only for 10 days that Saul-Juste oversaw the bureau. He left for Flanders to oversee the Committee of Orange and to smother the last few embers of democracy in the army by revoking the soldiers' right to petition. He also continued with his trademark ruthless discipline. Looters, rapists, or deserters, when apprehended, were summarily executed. Back in Paris, the bureau was given over to Robespierre, with Couthon assuming a secondary role. Robespierre was a lot more hands-off than Saul-Juste, only signing 30 decrees in his name. His focus was on arrests that would be amenable to the rest of the committee, but which would have the most impact. The ranks of civil service and government ministries, all across Paris, were purged of moderates, radicals, and foreigners. This included at one point Carnot's own secretaries, much to his annoyance. Even still, all these arrests only counted for around a quarter of all arrests, with general security still bearing the brunt of the workload. Robespierre, however, was unwilling to allow the bureau or general security to cooperate more than informally. He only allowed 4 cases to be shared between them. Despite appearances, however, this bureau was not Robespierre's Inquisition. Even though inundated with hundreds of denunciations, he was adamant that only provably counter-revolutionary suspects be referred to the tribunal. His notes from the time are rife with demands for more information, clarification, and caution. But I don't want you to get the idea that the police bureau or Robespierre weren't really that bad. Robespierre was able to keep his hands fairly clean, rarely ordering arrests himself, by having the tribunal actually carry out the sentences. This required him to have a good deal of trust in the tribunal, something that was only possible if it was stuffed with his guys. And it had been this way for months, as Robespierre selected names from a list he had drawn up in December, and installed these friends and allies in positions of power. Most of the Revolutionary Tribunal's judges were Robespierre's personal picks, so too were the 60 or so jurors. We've already met Souberville. Likewise, Monsieur Dupleix, Robespierre's friend and landlord, was given a supervisory role. Nepotism accounted for some of these appointments. For example, an 18-year-old son of one of Robespierre's old friends was made a representative on mission. Another was a 26-year-old Joachim Villot, who will pop up down the road as a victim of the Thermidorians. A lot of the picks were neighbours from along the Rue Saint-Honoré, or close confidants. Trust out of sight was the goal here, but trust had to be combined with ability, and few of these picks could be considered incapable. Most were lawyers, had pertinent experience, and a few were working-class artisans known to Robespierre. Criticisms of the committee's centralisation of power did surface, usually scorning Robespierre in particular. It was mostly the ousted civil servants and a few foolhardy opposition politicians who voiced these opinions. Though the politicians were protected, the pamphleteers and journalists were not. Even so, the committee had little need to outright censor their speech, though they did have wide-ranging powers to do so. It was sufficient to let the Committee of General Security round up these suspects and scare the living shit out of them. But it didn't really work. Most of the newspapers in Paris in the summer of 1794 were opposition papers, numbering 50 or more, with the largest being Feuille Villageoise, meaning something like the Village News. Through limited censorship, they were forced to rebrand every once in a while, but nonetheless continued to skirt the fine line between journalistic prerogatives and open sedition by claiming to play devil's advocate for counter-revolutionary groups like the Royalists or Federalists. Robespierre differed from the committee mainstream and made a successful bid to clamp down on dissenters in the press. This was quite a sea change for a man who had once been a staunch advocate of freedom of the press. What changed his mind is hard to pinpoint, but it likely runs parallel to his rising paranoia, which first appeared in March of 1793. These fears reached their peak in October, when the hostile press began to defend the Girondins during their trial. This was when Robespierre's foreign plot was first unsheathed, and he believed that the papers were intimately involved in the counter-revolution. For months following, he had tried to leverage his power in the committee to expand censorship, but found little support. Instead, Robespierre sought to fight fire with fire. The Jacobin propaganda network was confident and well established. Apart from the oft-mentioned L'Ami du Peuple and La Père du Chien, which was co-opted and basically became a Jacobin paper, I should add, there was a third big paper pushing the Jacobin line. It was called the Anti-Federalist, so guess what it was about? At the height of the Federalist revolts, the paper was a key weapon in the propaganda war. In September, a provincial transplant named Claude Payan became the new editor-in-chief. 28-year-old Payan had risen to prominence as an artillery commander, having served in the army that put itself between the Federalists of Marseille and Lyon. In Paris, Robespierre also gave him a role in the tribunal as a juror. After months of stellar service, Paon's name was the first both Robespierre and the committee considered to replace Chaumette as head of the Paris Commune. Paon took this position on March 30th, the first of the so-called national agents. These agents were to be the eyes and ears of the committee, replacing fully the representatives on mission, who were by 1794 more trouble than they were worth. Significantly fewer in number, the national agents were chosen for their reliability above all else, with most coming from Robespierre's list of names. In Paon's case, he was both reliable and direct, following Robespierre's orders to use the Commune to clamp down on the opposition press. He was only somewhat successful, with the opposition press going underground, and it was bad timing, because as April gave way to May, their invectives were tapping into the rising discontent of the sans-culottes. As it turned out, Robespierre's return to public life was short-lived. On April 19th, he took a leave of absence that would last a few weeks. The reason is unsurprising. Maintaining a rigid daily schedule, starting early in the morning and working well past midnight, left Robespierre mentally and physically exhausted. Struck down by another bout of illness, and in the absence of Saint-Just, the committee was left to Couthon and Barrère going into May. The timing would prove to be unfortunate. The committee's turn towards free market capitalism, their destruction or subjugation of the sections and the commune, as well as the wartime demands they placed upon the labouring poor, would hamstring committee attempts at conclusively answering the social question. Popular enthusiasm had spilled from the Jacobin sail, leaving them to rely upon their power, and not their popularity, to remain afloat.